When Laura Black landed her dream job in Silicon Valley, she had no idea that she would become the object of a co-worker's obsessive desires. Everywhere she went, Richard Farley seemed to be there. Everything she did, Richard Farley was watching. Finally, the sustained stalking episode culminated in a violent showdown that became one of California's most notorious mass murders. This episode includes descriptions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised. "22-year-old Laura Black had been working at Electromagnetic Systems Labs, known as ESL, for about a year when it all started. She enjoyed her work as an electrical engineer for the defense contractor in Sunnyvale, California, and she got on well with her colleagues and had even joined the company's softball team. She was the only woman in her department, and she was proud that she had made it into the heart of Silicon Valley through hard work and determination. Everything changed when she was introduced to 36-year-old co-worker Richard Farley in the spring of 1984. He was a software technician who had been at ESL for a few years since leaving the United States Navy. He was known for being a hard worker and always scored highly on his performance evaluations, although some colleagues found him a little arrogant. As Laura shook the hand of the slightly overweight, bespectacled man, she sensed his eyes boring into her as if they were trying to pierce her soul. It was an uncomfortable feeling, and she made her excuses as quickly as possible, telling him that she had to get back to work. She was glad they were not in the same department and quickly forgot about their brief interaction, blissfully unaware that over the coming years, Richard Farley would play an uninvited pivotal role in her life, occupying her thoughts far more than she could ever have imagined. After Richard had been introduced to Laura, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The moment he had set eyes on the beautiful young brunette, he had fallen immediately and irrevocably in love with her. He decided to ask her out on a date and was undeterred when she declined, asking again the next day and the next, even when he was met with a polite but firm rebuff each time. At first, Laura tried to shrug it off, assuming that the socially awkward ex-military man was lonely and had just had a harmless crush on her, although she wished he wasn't so persistent. She was careful not to give him false hope and made it clear that their relationship could only ever be a professional one. But even this didn't dampen Farley's enthusiasm. He assured her that he had high-level security clearance to do his job, and his background was checked by the military every 5 years. "America trusts me," he told her one day as he handed her a loaf of freshly baked blueberry bread, "and so should you." She frequently came into work to find homemade cakes and cards on her desk from Richard, who had managed to get past the cryptographically locked doors to access her office. His clearance seemed to allow him to go anywhere he wanted. Laura felt she could have put up with the unwanted attention in the workplace, but when it spilled over into her personal life, she was increasingly unsettled. During a softball game, she was horrified when she glanced over towards the bleachers and spotted Farley avidly watching her play. He then turned up at her aerobics class, which was even more disturbing. He could easily have found out that she was a member of the ESL softball team, but how did he know that she attended an aerobics class outside of work? The indifferent pity she had originally felt for the strange software technician who was so besotted with her was slowly turning into fear. She had been right to feel uncomfortable during their first meeting. There was something not right with Farley and things were getting out of hand. His unwanted attentions didn't stop at watching her exercise classes. Laura began receiving 2 handwritten letters from him every week, and she sometimes noticed him driving past her house at night. He even got hold of her phone number and called her so frequently that she was forced to change her number and have it delisted. Even with all this, she chose not to speak to company management about Farley's behaviour, as she didn't want to give the impression that she couldn't deal with something like this on her own. She refused to be a victim and intended to stand her ground. But she soon had to accept the frightening truth that the situation had escalated from a workplace crush to something much more sinister. There was no doubt about it, she was being stalked. Over the next couple of years, Laura moved home 3 times to prevent Farley knowing where she lived. Despite her extraordinary efforts to keep away from him, he always seemed to know where she was, partly because he continually followed her, and partly because he was accessing her office when she wasn't there and rifling through her work desk to find clues about her personal life. When she went on vacation for a much needed break, Richard Farley called her parents to try and find out where she had gone. By now, Farley's co-workers were noticing his odd behaviour, but each time anyone tried to broach the subject, he turned the conversation onto his extensive gun collection in a thinly veiled threat. His tone towards Laura also became darker and much more menacing. The frequency of his letters increased. He persistently called her late into the night and even told her, with an undertone of danger in his voice, that he knew where her parents lived. By October 1985, Laura realised she couldn't avoid telling her workplace about the harassment any longer. She filed a formal complaint about Richard Farley, and the Human Resources Department told him he had to attend counselling or risk losing his job. Things quietened down for a short period and Laura was relieved to experience freedom again, gradually unlearning the habit of always looking over her shoulder. Just 2 months later, in December 1985, Farley was back to his old ways, the counselling forgotten. This time, HR issued him with a written warning. All the letter from HR succeeded in doing was making Farley angry. One day, as Laura was getting into her car, he approached her with clenched fists and a look of outraged fury. "I'm not going to be a nice guy anymore," he told her. "I'm not going to ask you what to do, I'm going to tell you what to do." He then reminded her of his guns, warning her that he knew how to use them. HR's attempts to handle the unbalanced employee were ineffectual, and in February 1986, Farley confronted them and said they had no right to control his love life, a perverse turn of phrase which made it clear that his view of his relationship with Laura was vastly different from the reality. When the HR manager warned Farley that sexual harassment was illegal, he turned once again to his favourite method of getting his own way, by talking about his gun collection. This time he mentioned that he would take other people with him. Despite this overt threat, ESL did not immediately get rid of Farley, and he continued stalking Laura even more brazenly. Eventually the company couldn't put up with him any longer. He wasn't only harassing Laura, but he was unsettling other staff with his constant talk of guns. They acknowledged that he had given them a decade of excellent work, but over the last couple of years his performance had been badly affected by his obsession with Laura Black, and he was no longer operating at an acceptable level. His employment was terminated in May 1986. Richard had known it was coming, and he wrote Laura a distressing letter which read, "Once I'm fired, you won't be able to control me ever again. Pretty soon I'll crack under the pressure and run amok, and destroy everything in my path until the police catch me and kill me." ESL might have washed their hands of Richard Farley, but now that he no longer had a workplace to answer to, he had even greater free rein to terrorise Laura, for whom his so-called love was rapidly turning into something more destructive. He continued to hang around outside her home and in the ESL parking lot so he could watch her comings and goings. Despite his anger and the promise of no more Mr. Nice Guy, he named Laura as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy when he got a new job at rival company Covalent Systems. Although he was still a software engineer, his finances took a downward turn and he lost his car, his computer and his home. His obsession with Laura had led to a loss of control of his life, and in his twisted version of events, he believed she was solely to blame. He sent her a letter to tell her so, which read, "You cost me a job, $40,000 in equity taxes and a foreclosure, yet I still like you. Why do you want to find out how far I'll go? I absolutely will not be pushed around." Shortly afterwards, Laura found a small parcel on the windscreen of her car. Inside was a note from her stalker which said, "I can get to you anytime." A small metallic object fell out of the package and clattered to the ground, where Laura stared at it in horror, not wanting to believe what she was seeing. It was a copy of her house key. She had bravely stood her ground and fended off Farley's distasteful advances for almost 4 years, while trying to live her life as best she could. It was now time to seek legal advice. She took out a temporary restraining order on 8th February 1988, which meant that he was not allowed to come within 300 yards of her. This was the last straw for Richard Farley. The message had finally sunk in that Laura would never be his. He wasted no time in planning his final showdown. Originally, he had been blinded by a fixation which he believed to be love. Now he was blinded by anger. The day after the restraining order was issued, Farley purchased a 12-gauge Benelli semi-automatic shotgun to add to his collection, which included a Ruger 22 LR carbine, a Smith & Wesson 9mm pistol, a .357 Magnum, a Ruger M77 rifle and a Sentinel 22 caliber revolver. He also bought over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, a bulletproof vest, earplugs and a 12-inch knife. He spent over $2,000 that day, no longer caring about his financial difficulties. On Tuesday, 16th of February 1988, he dressed in military fatigues and his new bulletproof vest, and loaded up his motorhome with his breathtaking arsenal of weapons. When he arrived in the car park of the ESL officers, he strapped bandoliers of ammunition across his chest and armed himself with the staggering weight of almost 100 pounds of guns and bullets. He had thought about this moment so many times. Now he was going to make it happen. He strode through the car park towards the ESL building and shot and killed his first victim before he even entered the office, 46-year-old data processing specialist Larry Kane. Locked glass doors were the only thing standing between Farley and his ex-colleagues inside. He shot his way through them and stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on the fragments of shattered glass. Above all, he wanted Laura, but he would shoot anyone who got in his way. As he marched purposefully towards her office, he shot 6 employees with his semi-automatic, killing 4 of them instantly. From her office, Laura heard the distant sound of shots and sensed immediately that Richard Farley was responsible. She slammed and locked the door, praying that the police would arrive before he could get to her. But locks wouldn't delay him for long. He calmly lifted his shotgun and blew the door off its hinges before stepping inside and aiming the weapon directly at the woman he had pursued for the last 4 years. He fired twice and watched as Laura fell to the floor, then turned on his heel and left the room. What he didn't realise was that Laura was still clinging desperately to life while losing copious amounts of blood from a serious wound. The bullets had torn through the bone and muscles in her shoulder, severing multiple arteries. Struggling to remain conscious through the agony, Laura summoned every ounce of her energy to drag herself into an adjoining office. From the window she could see that ambulances and a SWAT team had arrived. She couldn't wait for them to come and rescue her, as she knew that Farley might return at any moment. Somehow, dripping blood and dangerously close to passing out, she made it outside into the parking lot. All around her, other survivors were either hiding or trying to creep out of the building to escape from the relentless shooter who until less than 2 years ago had been their co-worker. Once outside, Laura Black and her critically wounded colleagues were rushed to hospital. The SWAT team tried to get a lock on Farley's position to take him out, but he evaded them by moving from room to room. The ESL building was large and he had worked there long enough to know it inside out. A negotiator managed to get him on the phone and was met with a calm, dispassionate voice that was entirely without remorse, but carried a hint of delight at the death and destruction he had caused. Farley told them that his only regret was that Laura hadn't lived to see that the deaths were her fault, still unaware that she had survived his attack.
All this is about Laura Black.
This smug, murderous man was unrecognisable from the quiet, well-mannered boy he had once been. A child who had enjoyed maths and chemistry at school and liked to play table tennis, chess and bake cakes in his spare time. His aircraft mechanic father and his homemaker mother wouldn't recognise him now, nor would the neighbours and friends who remembered him as just a normal, happy kid. After a 5-hour standoff, Farley emerged from the building on the promise of a sandwich and soda to satiate the hunger he had worked up during his rampage. The police SWAT team closed in on him and took him into custody, putting an end to what had been the workday from hell for the employees of Electromagnetic Systems Labs. As he was arrested, Farley promised to smile for the cameras if he was sentenced to death for his crimes. During his violent onslaught, Farley had killed 7 employees and wounded another 4, including Laura Black, who survived her chest, shoulder and spine injuries. When she heard the news, Family Court Commissioner Lewis Kittle, who had issued the restraining order just over a week earlier, stated with sadness that pieces of paper do not stop bullets. Laura testified at Farley's trial in 1991, still experiencing the physical effects of the damage caused by the bullets. It was clear to the court that she had been through a nightmare experience, going to extreme lengths to avoid Farley's attentions over the last several years. The constant level of threat and the gross invasions of privacy that she had been subjected to had gone on for far too long. Farley pleaded not guilty, stating that he had intended to shoot up the building but had not planned to kill, which made a mockery of the clear evidence of premeditation and the fact that he had shot several of his victims in the back at point-blank range. On 21st of October 1991, Richard Wade Farley was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and 4 felonies and was sentenced to death. He was remanded to San Quentin prison, where he awaited the automatic appeals that are enshrined in California law for capital cases. The lengthy process dragged on for many years, and it was not until July 2009 that the Supreme Court announced that Farley's death sentence would be upheld. Although it seems unlikely that he will ever keep his appointment with the gas chamber, as the state has not executed anyone in over 17 years. There was one positive development to come out of the horrific shootings. In 1990, California passed the first anti-stalking laws in America, following the events in Sunnyvale and the murder of 19-year-old actress and model Rebecca Schaeffer by a crazed fan in the same year. It is tragic that these deaths had to happen before the laws were enacted, finally offering some degree of protection for stalking victims, of whom the vast majority are female. Richard Farley wrote Laura one last letter from prison, telling her that she had finally won. It is doubtful that it felt like a victory for her, having received life-changing injuries and seen her co-workers killed, or because she had been unlucky enough to become the target of Farley's irrational infatuation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This case was taken from my true crime book, Murder Casebook Volume 2. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandrand.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.